Okay, I think we have a good amount of people here now, and obviously I'll let some people in as they come in, but hi, and thank you for joining us today. This is part 5 of the Anesthesia Bootcamp series. I'm Laura Herrera, Vice President of Marketing for Somnia Anesthesia. Today's topic is titled Creating Coverage, Part 1, Starting a Residency Program, Rotations ARRP Program. Joining us today is Dr. Mark Koch. He's our CEO and President of Somnia Anesthesia. We will have a Q&A at the end of this presentation where we'll be able to answer any of your questions. Feel free to ask questions during the presentation in the chat box, and we will get to it at the end. All of our presentations will be available on YouTube and accessible through our social media channels. The Anesthesia Bootcamp series will be running all month long. Be sure to visit www.somniainc.com/bootcamp for a list of our scheduled webinars. So let's get started.
Thanks everybody for attending our series today. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the way we could leverage education to address some of the shortages that are afoot. So we're going to look at this two ways. First, we're going to take a look at an analogous industry, the airline industry, and see how they're dealing with it. And see if that could inspire us to think of ideas that might be helpful with regard to anesthesia shortages. And then we're going to get into some details on those educational ideas, not go into too much depth, but give you a sense of how they can help you, hospitals, address some of the shortages that are afoot. So let's take a look at the airline industry and how they are dealing with this. The answer is not so good. They too, like anesthesia, have seen resignations of late and end career pilots. In addition, training new pilots, just like training new anesthesia clinicians, has also been beleaguered. They haven't had as many opportunities to fly planes and accrue the hours they needed to finish their programs. Similarly, anesthesia residents at CRNA schools have had a little bit of a hard time accruing cases and hours of anesthesia. You may recall from one of our earlier presentations, I showed you how the percentage of anesthesiologists that were between the ages of 50 and 60 and above 65 was much more significant than the number that were either newly graduated or early career. Now, the airline industry has the same problem. Approximately 13% are within 5 years of retirement, and the average age is between 51 and 59. Now, what has the airline industry done to combat their shortages? Well, one approach they took is they're cutting routes. They're cutting flights. Well, what are hospital surgery centers and some office-based facilities having to do? Some are going to have to start to cut rooms, close rooms, and in some cases defer surgery. And true to our point today, many of them are starting to rethink and reimagine how education and training could be one potential durable solution to fix the problem. Now, one example of that is whereas commercial pilots have required about 1,500 hours before they could fly a commercial plane with passengers in it, there is some talk about maybe reducing those number of hours as one approach, or eliminating the need for a 4-year degree as another approach. Again, something to think about as we begin to examine the anesthesia shortage. Well, some of them even went one step further. Some of them opened schools up. And other ones are starting to offer loans, or I suspect subsidies, to get people into those schools. So we could begin to train them, and we could begin to start them on the road to become pilots. Again, very analogous to anesthesia. You know, needing more residency slots, needing more CRNA schools, more AA schools. I mean, very, very similar. Now, the airline industry has a couple options we really don't have here yet. You know, they are bringing in pilots from other countries. Now, there's no reason we cannot do that. It just requires a lot more process and having to scale a lot of hurdles to do that, particularly on the physician front. Other ideas we can do quite easily. Many of the FAA and other government agencies are thinking about raising the retirement age. Well, in anesthesia, both physicians and CRNAs we can, if we could get people to do it, they could stay on a little bit longer and work a little bit later into their career. That's one option. This is one thing that I thought was kind of funny. They're giving some passengers bus tickets. Well, I don't know if there's an analogy in really anesthesia for that one, but I don't know. Maybe we send them to an ASC. I can't see an analogy there. I just thought it was interesting. But again, taking a look at how we can maybe learn from this, most of the executives in the airline industry admit it's not going to be a quick fix. It's not going to be a singular solution. It's going to be a long haul. And one of my messages for everybody on this call today to underscore, this is not going to be a quick fix. It's going to take a little bit of time. And the approaches that we discuss here, some are quicker than others, but all of them require time and resources to get them done. So let's summarize what we went over. The airline industry cut flights. Are some hospitals and surgery centers going to have to shut rooms? They reduced flight logging times, as I mentioned, from 1,500. They're thinking about maybe bringing it back down to 750 or maybe just a lower number. Well, are some of the anesthesia training programs, both on the physician and the CRNA fronts, going to be reducing the case counts and the accrued case log requirements? Foreign pilots, there might be an opportunity here, but it's going to require a lot of process to actually push that forward. Raise the retirement age. No reason why we can't do that here. We can find physicians and CRNAs willing to work later in their career. Let's welcome them. That's part of what we're going to be discussing going forward. More flight schools. Hey, that's one we could really latch on to, and that's what we're going to be talking about here today. Anesthesia remediation and reentry programs, CRNA schools, and residency programs. And some of these flight schools are funding or giving loans to their students. Well, why can't we develop Earn While You Learn programs to encourage people to come into our training programs? So there is a huge burning platform with anesthesia. There are huge shortages of both anesthesiologists and CRNAs. And it's getting worse. The anesthesia workforce is aging. And as they're aging, these shortages are making them have to work harder. And in addition, the training takes a while. There's no quick solution here. But let's look at that on a micro level. What happens at a specific hospital or surgery center? Incomplete staffing means people that are there working harder. And maybe if these are mid or late career and career clinicians, what's going to happen is they're going to get burned out, just like their earlier career counterparts. As they burn out, they're going to leave. And now your situation got worse. And I'm seeing a lot of this, lots of it, where those people that have decided to defer retirement and stay in the workforce are getting burnt out and leaving. And that's a caution to facilities out there to be careful with what you do, and because the impact could worsen your problem. So let's talk a little bit about the Anesthesiology Remediation and Refresher Program. This is a specific program we developed. What it addresses is it addresses this gap. And the gap is between anesthesiologists that are in the system, one of the databases, but they have not submitted claims into Medicare, which means they're available. Now, some of them are going to be in surgery centers, cosmetic surgery centers, yeah, of course, but there's a significant number that are probably out there and would like to come work. As you think about remediation programs and reentry programs, it sounds a little complicated, but it's really not. Physicians' knowledge, competency, and skills evolve. I mean, listen, there are many older or later career surgeons that needed to go back and learn robotics. The premise here, and I think we all know this, the skills we learn, the knowledge we accrued doesn't disappear. It just gets a little rusty, and we got to get off that rust. That proctoring is nothing new. We do proctoring all the time in medicine. So these reentry and remediation programs that rely heavily on proctoring and supervision, nothing new. And finally, there are mechanisms and guidelines for this sort of proctoring. You have IPPE, an initial physician practice evaluation. You have ongoing physician practice evaluations, and you have focused physician practice evaluations. So there are guidelines and ways that we could approach this that currently exist. Ultimately, as we talk about these late and end career physicians that have not been submitting bills to Medicare and are out there and want to go back to work, it's important to remember that's where they are today, their baseline, and where they want to be going forward. Everybody's going to have a different baseline, and everybody's going to have a different goal. Somebody might have a lot of more recent knowledge, competency, and skill, and they want to work in a place that isn't so intense. And other people might be starting out with a little bit less current knowledge, competency, and skill and want to work in like a level 1 trauma center. So these gaps are going to predict what sort of remediation and reentry needs to be accomplished for them to achieve their goals. For the remediation program we developed, there were 4 cohorts of anesthesiologists. One, those people who left medicine altogether. Maybe it was due to an illness, an injury, maybe they were a stay-at-home dad or mom, but they need to really come back in and they're not giving anesthesia now. There's a second cohort of anesthesiologists that have worked in a very limited environment. By that I mean like a cataract center or a GI center, where now they want to go back to the hospital. And these people are another cohort. There's another cohort of people that need to go in a supervised setting because of some state requirement, maybe board of medicine or what have you. And finally, the 4th cohort are people that have not been able to pass their boards or never endeavored to pass their boards or enter the board process, that need to now go back in and reset the process. Our particular program required residency completion, board certification, unless that's the reason they're coming into the program. And we took a very programmatic approach to it. We emulated the ACGME tenets, and we embraced the ACCME tenets. Although it's an imperfect model, one way to conceptualize this is we took a residency and we smushed it into a limited period of time. And the way we envision this is there would be a period of time where they were like a new first-year resident for a period of time. Then they would be like a second-year resident for a period of time, and then a third-year resident for a period of time. And this compaction of a residency program, if you will, could take in total 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, a year. It would be based upon their baseline knowledge, competency, and skill, and where they needed or wanted to work going forward. Now, the program we developed took a lot of time, and there were a lot of stakeholders we had to work with. There was the medical staff office, there was academic affairs, there was the OR staff, there was the clinicians on site who needed to serve as faculty, and other stakeholders, of course. But it was a well thought through, planned out program that we did, and it took us about 18 months to develop the program. As I mentioned before, the gap between existing knowledge, competency, and skill and the knowledge, competency, and skill they would need to go out and practice in the environment that they chose, i.e. a hospital, those gaps would give way to an individualized learning plan. And that individualized learning plan would build into it didactic needs, this concept where they needed to build up their competence and confidence. We would need to deal with more than just clinical issues. There was Joint Commission and CMS requirements. And there was having to realize that best practices have evolved from where they had previously maybe learned them. And there's a professionalism component as well. And I don't want to get into that, but it's a component as well. The goal here was to take a look at existing competence and confidence along various skill sets and then see how we could advance them. so their confidence would gain ahead of steam as their competence gained ahead of steam. Now, these learning plans are really important, predicated on gaps. They served as a basis for how people in the program would advance. It served as a basis for how we would contextually view evaluations, and it served as a basis for understanding the nature of what we actually did to close those gaps. So the learning plan gave way to assessments, and those assessments were used to take a look at how we would advance clinicians in the program, how we started to throttle back the supervision and allow them to practice more independently. But this approach was methodical, structured, and nothing we did was cavalier. Now, the remediation program is right now, it took us about 18 months to do our first program and launch it. With everything that we've done, we do think that the lead time for that will probably be much shorter, probably more like 6 months or less going forward for those facilities that want to undertake it. We're going to talk briefly now about residency programs. Now, for sure, we need more residents. You know, the anesthesiology community has done a wonderful job increasing the number of slots. You know, the thing here is, are those slots going to be sufficient to address the number of people that might be leaving the workforce due to retirement? And that's why it's not going to be the only solution, and it'll be part of a larger set of solutions that help address the problem. Residency programs are not quick. I mean, they take no less than 24 months, and there are a lot of planning and work. The institutions need to become accredited, and it requires other service lines be on site. It's a pretty significant lift in terms of project. There are many, many milestones and areas that need to be addressed, and they are both clinical and non-clinical. Most importantly, if you want to develop an ACGME residency program, you need to recruit a lot of faculty. Right? Now, just at a time when we have all these shortages, you have to find faculty for critical care, OB anesthesia, pediatric anesthesia, neuroanesthesia, cardiothoracic anesthesia, pain. I mean, this is a pretty big lift, because if the marketplace is short and there are shortages, that's also going to impact the faculty that might be out there and available. Also, the case counts are not insignificant. And, you know, if you don't do cardiac, or you don't do neuro, or you don't do pediatrics, then it's going to be almost impossible to get a program done. You know, you're going to have to do more than 50% of those cases at the institution where the program is domiciled. And not every institution has the right case types and volume for this to be successful. Also, there are significant supervision requirements. You have to have an attending anesthesiologist, oversee only 1 or 2 residents. It's not like having a CRNA, where in some states you might be able to have up to 4. In some states they could practice independently, but in those states that they can't, you could have up to 4. And with a residency program, that's only 2. Now, it's not all gloom and doom. The good news is, for those facilities that decide they do want to undertake an ACGME residency program, there's funding through DME, direct medical education reimbursement, which is on a per resident basis. There's also indirect medical education, which involve adjustments to Medicare payments. And just bear in mind that your ability to get access funding really depends on whether you're, as a facility, you have or have not exceeded or your cap, or the window to bring in programs has closed with regard to a Medicare cap. So let's talk a little bit about nurse anesthesia school and rotations. And this is a little bit of a lesser lift, meaning in terms of work and faculty and in terms of process. First things, this is a sample state, it's Illinois. Just like with the anesthesiologists, there's a shortage of CRNAs, right? This is for Illinois. And actually in 2021, guess what? We actually went down in terms of the number of new graduates in Illinois. So there's no, again, new programs or having rotations. It's not a panacea. It's not going to be your only solution. And it alone is not going to solve the problem. The lead time to develop a de novo school or rotations is not quick. I mean, if you want to have rotations set up at your facility, that might be quicker, maybe 12 months, maybe 6 months. You know, if you want to actually do a school, no shortcuts. That's going to be 18 to 24 months, not that much different than an anesthesia residency program. Now, let's talk a little bit about having student nurse anesthesia rotators at your facility could be really helpful. First of all, the school you work with, the nurse anesthesia school you work with might be able to work with you and develop a program where there's preferred, guaranteed, or funded admission to the program. Now, there's no shortcuts. I mean, you have a school, you want the best and the brightest, and this is not a shortcut, but it's a way for somebody who's highly qualified that would otherwise gain entry and allow them to have preferred, guaranteed, or funded admission into the program after they complete 1, 2, or 3 years of ICU work at a hospital. And that's because nurse anesthesia schools absolutely require that applicants complete critical care rotations. Next, having rotators is a great way to recruit and retain new grads. Let's face it, somebody's in your hospital for a year, maybe more than a year, doing rotations. They get to know the surgeons, they get to know the senior CRNAs, they get to know the surgeons, they get to know the anesthesiologists, and many of them will want to stay on. Moreover, if you're a hospital, you might be able to fund some of those student nurse anesthetists. Something like an earn while you learn. So you say to a given school, listen, could we fund, some dollars here so that students, when they graduate, in exchange for us giving that student some dollars for their tuition, they agree to stay with us 1, 2, or 3 years after they graduate. Those Earn While You Learn programs are a great way for hospitals to retain graduated students. Now think about it. Let's say they're in CRNA school for 3 years. Let's say they do 3 years of ICU work at that hospital. And let's say they do an Earn While You Learn program for 3 years. Well, that could be up to 9 years commitment at a hospital. And what that does, it could build tremendous loyalty to a given facility. Now, again, there's a price to be paid. Those Earn While You Learn programs might cost some money, right? Developing a program where you could offer preferred, guaranteed, or funded admission to a school, that costs money to administrate as well. But comparatively, I think the upside is remarkable with regard to helping alleviate some of the ICU nurse shortages and some of the nurse anesthesia shortages that hospitals are facing. Finally, in addition to the ICU recruitment and retention, in addition to the postgraduate CRNA recruitment and retention, there's also an opportunity to recruit seasoned CRNAs. And that's because many CRNAs like to teach. And when they hear you're going to have student rotators at your hospital, there'll be a cohort of practicing CRNAs that will say, I want to teach. And they may be willing to come to your hospital for the opportunity to teach rotating CRNAs. Now, why do I like CRNA rotations? There's limited faculty preceptor requirements. Now, why I really like having nurse anesthesia rotators is because there's limited, if any, startup or maintenance costs. It's pretty easy, pretty quick, and very limited costs. If you want to do one of those Earn While You Learn programs, or if you want to do one of those funded ICU ideas, it might cost a little bit. But other than that, if you don't decide to do that, there's really limited, if any, cost behind it. Now let's talk a little bit, summarize here. As we all know, we're in the midst of a great resignation. It's impacting many industries. If we take a look at analogous industries, it could give us a sense of inspiration, give us ideas. It could also validate some of our ideas as well. One of those ideas that we discussed as a major category was education and training. We discussed residency programs. We talked about how there's a lot of process, longer lead time, a lot of faculty requirements. But if you decide to do it, there is some federal dollars out there for those schools, for those residency programs at hospitals that qualify. The remediation programs, that's pretty quick, probably around 6 months. No compliance concerns, no ACGME or Council on Accreditation requirements. You have a little bit more flexibility in program design and implementation. And one of my favorites, not the only favorite, but one of them, are these nurse anesthesia rotations because they're quick to start. It helps the hospital potentially with some of their ICU nursing shortages, and there's no cost unless you do want to do one of those Earn While You Learn programs. And that's why I like it a lot. So that's the end. And I'm going to open this up because we do have a few minutes for questions. I left about 5 minutes for questions. So let's open it up to see if we have any questions from the audience.
Okay, thanks, Mark, for that great presentation. We have one question. What's the one program that you would pick to do something as quickly as possible for my hospital? Mark, I think we can't hear you.
Thank you, Laura. I think if I had to pick one thing to do first, because it's quick, it's well defined, it requires very little, if any, external involvement or approvals or whatever. It'd probably be the CRNA rotation, the nurse anesthesia rotations. It's hard when you have a quick start, no cost option to not do that. If I was a hospital, I'd be doing that right away because for those reasons. I know I said it could be 6 to 12 months, but you know what? Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's 4 or 6 months, pretty quick. So I think that would clearly be the first one. The remediation programs would probably be a close second because there's a lot of flexibility and there's a lot of opportunity to build in safety and outcome metrics. And the administrative costs could be higher and the evaluation requirements could be significant, but and then some hospitals, it's just not for every hospital, right? They just don't want it because it's risky. They think it's risky to have people that haven't practiced for a while, or maybe have practiced in a different setting like GI lab, whatever, for a while. So, because it can be a little bit more inertia with regard to working with hospital governance structures, and because it require higher administrative costs, I'd probably put that second. And then residency programs, I go to the ACGME every year. We have residency programs. We spend a lot of time, energy, and effort developing them and getting them going. And I personally enjoy them just as much as anything else. But despite the fact that I enjoy developing them and working with hospitals with them, the reality is that finding all those faculty to come is a pretty big lift. And it's only going to get worse as the sort of great resignation is being lived by all of us. That's going to make it even harder to get faculty. So that would be number 3. Any other questions, Laura?
No, Mark, we do not. And actually, we ran out of time. So we're 1:30. It's time to say goodbye. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Please remember to visit www.somniainc.com/bootcamp to register for our next upcoming webinars. Have a great day, everyone.